of the country. This is some maps by my colleague Natasha Harlow, who's done a lot of work on the Iceni, and you can see that their coins are really concentrated in this eastern part of the country. Now, the coins also tell us some interesting things about the Iceni and who they were. We have a number of names on the coins. It's sometimes argued that these names refer to kings or leaders, and that the Eke or Eken coins refer to Iceni. The interesting thing about the names is that there are far too many of them to represent individual kings of the Iceni. So although we think of the Iceni as a single tribe under a single leader, the coin evidence shows that there are a lot of people minting coins at the same time. So it's quite likely that they're a much more fragmented group than would be is suggested by Roman sources. Possibly they're a fairly fragmented lot who come together in times of war. We also have coins with the name Prasto on, and these are originally thought to refer to King Prasutagus, who's famed in Roman sources as the husband of Boudicea, but this is by no means certain. As I say, there are a lot of places minting coins at about the same time, so we certainly don't have a unified tribe with a single ruler suggested by Roman sources, although it's possible that the fact that the Romans treated them as a single group may actually have been a factor in creating a sense of themselves as a single group. They are particularly famous for putting large amounts of treasure in the ground, particularly things like these the wonderful Snettisham talks, which we can see here on the left in the British Museum excavations, and then the earlier find of the Great Talk, where we can see the ploughman who found it helpfully reenacting the discovery for the cameras at the time. These talks are really characteristic of the Iceni, and whenever you see depictions of Boudicea, she's always wearing one of these talks. And this is because she's described as doing this, or described as wearing a large golden necklace by Cassius Dio, who's one of the principal Roman sources. And Dio describes as this great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips, around which around her neck was a large gold necklace. However, the archaeology suggests actually people weren't wearing talks by the time of the Boudiccan revolt. They're probably gone out of fashion. And what Cassius Dio may well be doing is employing a sort of stock barbarian description. The Romans had very stereotypical barbarians that appear in a lot of their writing, and this may be what's happening with Boudicea. And we'll come back to this in a little while. So we have a vague sense of who the Iceni are and where they are. What about Boudicea? Who is she? Who was she? Why did she cast such a long shadow? I'm not going to tell you very much about the revolt. You probably all know a little bit about it. There are 1,000 books about it. or you can go and watch Boudicca's Lost Tribe on Channel 4, where you can see a pretty cheap reenactment of it involving about 10 people. The version of the Boudica story that we all know is that she was the wife of the Icenian king Prasutagus, although it's possible Prasutagus is a title rather than a name. And the Iceni were a client kingdom of Rome. They were allowed to be self-governing as long as they paid their tax. When Prasutagus died, he was supposed to leave the kingdom to Rome, but instead left only half of it, trying to bequeath the rest of it to his wife and daughters. The Romans, however, disagreed. Boudica was flogged, her daughters were raped, and in AD 60/61, the Iceni rose and revolts, and they stormed Colchester, London, and Verulamium. Now, there's quite good archaeological evidence for some of these episodes at Colchester, for example, and London, although rather less at Verulamium. And here we can see the sort of recently found Fenwick treasure from Colchester, which is probably a collection of material that was hidden or lost in the revolt. And eventually the Iceni and their allies are defeated in battle by the governor Suetonius Paulinus at an unknown location. 80,000 were apparently killed in the final battle for the loss of only 400 Roman soldiers. Boudica then dies or takes poison, although the sources differ. Tacitus tells us that in the aftermath, hostile and wavering tribes were ravaged with fire and sword, but the enemy's worst affliction was famine, for they had neglected to sow their fields and had brought everyone available into the army, intending to seize our supplies, so the Roman supplies. And I'll come back to this a little later. Now, like all good sources from history, when you pick it apart, it becomes a bit tricky. And so what I want to do now is look very briefly at some of the textual sources for the revolt. We know about Boudica principally from three often contradictory classical sources, from which people have generally taken the bits they like to come up with the story of the flame-haired warrior queen taking on the might of Rome. The earliest is Tacitus's Agricola, which is written in about AD 98, so just under 4 decades or so after the revolt. And the Agricola gives a bare bones account of a revolt against military bases, naming Boudica as a lady of royal descent as the leader. Although elsewhere, the Agricola suggests that it's actually the Brigantes, who are a tribe in the north of in the north of Britain, who were revolting. So if we only had the Agricola, we would think that Boudica was from northern England. It's only in the Annals, written about 20 years after the Agricola, that we get the story of Prasutagus and the Iceni, and the will and the rape of the daughters and this sort of thing. And the Annals gives a much fuller account that informs much of the popular story and introduces the destruction of Colchester, London, and Verulamium. And this is the one in which Boudica drives around in a chariot with her daughters, gives a big speech, and which Tacitus entirely makes up for his own purposes. And what Tacitus is particularly interested in doing is using the account of the revolt and Boudica's role of sort of noble savage to critique contemporary society in Rome. Our third source is Cassius Dio, and he's writing in the early 3rd century, probably about 150 years or so after the revolt, who gives us a lot of detail that Tacitus doesn't, and it's thought that he may be referring to an otherwise lost source. And Dio gives the description of Boudicea, from which all the artistic depictions spring. And he says the following: in stature, she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, in the glance of her eye most fierce, and in her voice most harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. Around her neck was a large gold necklace, and she wore a tunic of diverse colors, over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. And he then gives a very big and flowery speech, or he lets Boudicea have a very big and flowery speech, which finishes with her letting a hair come from the folds of her dress as a form of divination. And she invokes Andraste, who's a supposed British goddess. Now, what Dio was particularly interested in, along with a lot of our favorite facts about Boudicea, was partly made up or using ideas about gender and masculinity and femininity as a means of criticizing contemporary society in Rome. And Dio gives Boudicea words about the Emperor Nero that reflected 3rd century concerns about effeminate behavior in his own times. So Boudicea criticizes Nero, who, though in name is a man, is in fact a woman, as is proved by his singing, lyre playing, and the beautification of his person. So Dio is particularly worried about this effeminate behavior. And the reason he's particularly worried about it, because he's writing fairly close to the reign of the Emperor Elagabalus, and who's famous for flouting gender norms. He wears makeup, and he's it's recounted that he has what we would now know as gender reassignment surgery, and Dio is particularly worried about this. And so both Tacitus and Dio are particularly interested in the behavior of Boudicea, who as a woman taking on power is flouting the norms of Roman society and committing these sort of transgressions of ideas about gender, which were particularly of concern to both Tacitus and Dio. And she's also, of course, used to emphasize the alien weirdness of the British, which all Roman writers always do. The British are weird, they're a long way away, they do lots of odd stuff, and they can be used to demonstrate lots of points about barbarian behavior. So the Roman sources are a little bit questionable, but this doesn't stop Boudicea taking on a new life from the 16th century onwards, when writers and playwrights became particularly interested in the Boudicea story. Again, using it as metaphors, using it as a way of understanding contemporary society. And by the early 16th century, she had become Boudicea, as I say, a name based on a miscopying of Tacitus. And in the 17th and 18th century, she becomes a stock figure in numerous poems and plays. Perhaps the most important is William Cowper's Boudicea an Ode, which was written in 1782, in which she's reinvented as an icon for the British Empire. And his poem is tremendously popular, particularly in the Victorian period, when the idea of a strong, all-conquering woman has obvious resonance. And this is Thornycroft's statue of Boudicea and her daughters, And it has a quote from Cooper's poem on the plinth, um, which says, region Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway. So basically it's saying that Rome couldn't conquer, didn't conquer nearly as much as the British Empire, and therefore Victoria is taking on this mantle. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, she's gone from strength to strength as a fighter against oppression, a feminist icon. And in Norfolk, where the idea of burning London and towns in the home counties remains pretty popular, she's a symbol of the county's tradition of independence. This does mean, however, that she carries a lot of baggage with her. And it also means that a lot of the archaeological evidence for the Iceni and the Roman period in the Iceni region is viewed through what we might call Boudicea tinted spectacles. The archaeological evidence for the revolt is actually quite good, although there is a tendency to include all sorts of things in what we might call the revolt story. This is the wonderful tombstone of Longinus Sedapese, found in Colchester, and this was originally thought to have been destroyed by Boudicca's rebels, hacking the face off, and you can see on the left the face is missing. The angry rebels hacked the face off during the revolt, but actually it was damaged by workmen putting in a water main in the 19th century, and later on the face was actually found in the fill of their pipe trench. Similarly, these are the skulls from the Walbrook in London, and again, these have often been associated with the Boudiccan revolt. And then we have possibly more convincingly a head of Claudius recovered from the River Old in Suffolk, which is interpreted as war booty carried away by the Iceni. So the archaeological evidence is complicated, and we also have to remember that we have only Roman sources. So understanding the Iceni and shaking off the shackles of the Boudica myth has been a key part of the work that I've been doing for the last 12 years or so at the town of Venturi Icenorum in Norfolk. These excavations have been carried out by firstly the University of Nottingham, and then by a Caister Roman project, who is a long-standing volunteer group that we set up about 15 years ago to support and help with the work, and now lead the work that we're doing at Caister. And so I'm going to sort of use the rest of this talk to explain a little bit about what we found and what it tells us about the Iceni in the aftermath of the rebellion. So the site that we're talking about lies just to the south of Norwich. If you ever go into Norwich on the train, you can see it very clearly on the train from the train window, or if you're whizzing past Norwich on the A47 on your way to the flesh pots of Great Yarmouth, you can again see the site fairly clearly from the road. Now, the name Venturi Icenorum, as I mentioned earlier, literally means market of the Iceni, and it's preserved in the 3rd century document known as the Antonine Itineraries, and Ptolemy also refers to Venta in the 2nd century as the one notable town of the Iceni. It's assumed to be the Civitas capital, the regional centre for the Iceni, although there's no specific reference to it as such. And it's first, the site at Caister St Edmund is first recognised as the venter of the Antonine itineraries by William Camden. It first comes to real archaeological attention in 1929. There's a very dry summer in 1928, and a series of iconic aerial photographs are taken of the site. It's a greenfield site, so there's no modern occupation over it, and so the streets and buildings show up very, very clearly from the air. The walls of the town, which are the sort of rectangular shape you can see running around it, are the only extant feature of the site. The rest of it is buried under a field. If you go to, I recommend you visit it. It's a lovely site, but you'll see the town walls and then a lot of sheep in the middle, which are also quite picturesque. We've done geophysical survey now totaling around 50 hectares, and it shows that the town extended well beyond the late Roman wall circuit. You have to also remember that for most of its history, the town probably doesn't have its walls. They're a late Roman addition. Now, the aerial photographs, which I just showed you, caused enormous excitement, and they led to the first excavations of the site carried out by a man called Donald Atkinson between 1929 and 1935. And here you can see this is the period when archaeologists really knew how to dress. Atkinson isn't in this picture, and we don't have a picture of him at all, which rather suggests that he seems to have been the sort of archaeological director who would sort of turn up, say, call me if you find something interesting, and leave the workmen to get on with it. Obviously, I aspire to that sort of direction, but haven't quite managed it. And what he does is investigate a series of the most visible crop marks, so the buildings that can be really clearly seen from the air. And he excavates public buildings, and so the Forum Basilica, which we can see down here in the bottom right, a pair of small temples, a bath complex, and the south gate of the fortifications. Now, Donald Atkinson's interpretation of the site was pretty straightforward, and interestingly, his interpretation of the site doesn't seem to have been changed by the excavations. He's interpreted the site really, according to the Eastern Daily Press, the newspaper coverage, almost before he's put a spade in the ground. And he argues that the town is laid out and occupation began in the reign of Vespasian, presumably when the effects of the revolt of Boudicea had passed away and the Iceni had been pacified. And so in Atkinson's interpretation, the street grid was laid out around AD 70, so less than 10 years after the revolt. And for Atkinson, the development of the town was retarded by the backwardness of the Iceni. They were a bit barbaric. The Romans laid out this nice town for them, but they weren't really up to the task of being Roman. For Atkinson, they were conservative with a small c and achieved an imperfect degree of Romanization. Now, the other thing that has been enormously influential in understanding of the aftermath of the revolt and the Iceni is this description of Tacitus, which has caused the Iceni to be always viewed as impoverished. And if you remember, Tacitus says that the hostile tribes were ravaged with fire and sword, very 1066 and all that. But the enemy's worst affliction was famine, for they had neglected to sow their fields and had brought everyone into the army, intending to seize our supplies. And this idea of the Iceni being impoverished by the revolt has become canonical in all the literature on Roman Britain. And if ever you read a book, and there's some, the David Mattingly's Imperial Possession, which is, I think, one of the best existing general textbook on Roman Britain, still contains the idea that Caestar is Venter Icenorum is very small, rather not terribly impressive. And this is because the Iceni didn't have any money after they were impoverished by the revolt. So our understanding of this town has been coloured really by thinking about Boudicea and by the effects of the revolt. We have a set of assumptions regarding the role of the site in the aftermath of the Boudiccan revolt, and that Venter Icenorum was founded as a response to the revolt has remained unquestioned in all the literature on Roman Britain. All the literature, however, is in agreement that it was the Iceni living in the town. But it's always been a problem to get people to really accept that the Iceni are still there after the Boudiccan revolt. This is really a fundamental misconception about the Romans in Britain. People tend to think that the Romans came in AD 43 and did some Roman stuff and then left in AD 409. Locally, Caestar is known as the Roman camp, and indeed it appears as the Roman camp on early Ordnance Survey maps. And I always think that the Roman camp has in it the idea that the Romans came, camped for a bit, and then went away again. And it's certainly true that there were quite a lot of immigrants in Roman Britain, but probably about 80 or 90% of the island's inhabitants during the Roman period were born there and were descended from the pre-Roman population. Even at its maximum size of about 50,000, the Roman army constituted about 0.5% or less of the total population of Roman Britain, and none of them were living in Caestar. So it's the Iceni living in Caestar. What does the archaeology actually tell us about them? What do we know about them? We have a lot of interesting data from the site. But why is the Roman town actually where it is? Roman towns often have their origins in either military bases, as in the case of partly of Colchester, or in pre-Roman settlements. Now, one of the things we wanted to find was the Iron Age, the pre-existing Iron Age settlement at Caestar, and we've dug 13 trenches within and around the town. And I think I could have dug 13 trenches in any given field in Norfolk, and I would have found more Iron Age material than I did at Caestar, which was a little bit frustrating. But we do have some indication of Boudicca period activity to the north east of the site in the grounds of the Caestar Hall Hotel. And interestingly, these are brooches being made around the time of the Boudiccan revolt, but they're a type of brooch more typically associated with the Trinovantes, who may be quite familiar to you as being sort of local to that sort of Hertfordshire, Essex area. There's no obvious sign, however, of a Roman fort in the region. There are two clues as to why the site is where it is. The first is the River Taz, which you can perhaps see as this sort of snaking line off to the left of the site in this aerial picture. And for a long time, it was thought that the River Taz was navigable as far as Caister from the sea. And certainly a lot of what you now see as the Norfolk Broads is in part the remnants of a major estuary system that entered into Norfolk, and you could certainly sail a long way into Norfolk. The Yarmouth sandbar wasn't there in the Roman period. But certainly all the work that we've done suggests that the River Taz is actually fairly small and only navigable by small flat-bottom boats during the Roman period. It may have been fordable, or it may have been an Iron Age cult site, a religious site. We're not really sure, perhaps associated with the river. We certainly have probably an Iron Age cult site at a temple we've been digging to the northeast of the town, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But it's my tentative suggestion that the town is not founded as a post-Boudiccan reprisal, but probably at a pre-Roman existing religious site, which continued to be venerated into the Roman period. Although Donald Atkinson suggests that the streets are laid out after the Boudiccan revolt, about AD 70, all the evidence that we have is that they date to about 40 years later. Quite a few of them were excavated by Atkinson, and we've also had a look at them. And they're made up of layer upon layer of rammed gravel. This is a section that we cut through one of them. And this means that they're thick layers of gravel and they don't hold moisture very well. And so they show up really clearly from the air. But what we can clearly see is that they develop over time. They're not laid out in a single grandiose act of Roman town planning. We also start to get public buildings from the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. There are signs of an early forum, so the main administrative building, built in timber and clay, and decorated with painted plaster, and this is replaced, it burns down in about AD 140 and is replaced with a stone-built forum. And this would have been the centre of government for the region. The forum is one of the smallest fora in Roman Britain, and this is always seen as a sign of the impoverishment of the town and the impoverishment of the Iceni. But fora are a place of public display and participation in civic life. And this never really takes off in Britain to the extent that it did in the Mediterranean and on the continent. Although we do have fora in Roman Britain, there's never a real sense that people in Roman Britain are ever that interested in civic participation. Most of the fora in Roman Britain, and including Caister, have a very short lifespan. And certainly at Caister, its porticos become choked with rubbish. It gets used as a rubbish dump within about 50 years of it being built. Unlike Silchester, Verulamium, Colchester, Wroxeter. There are no large courtyard houses at Caister. Norfolk as a whole has produced only a handful of mosaics, and there are very little in the way of villas. So the Iceni aren't buying into the idea of display through big houses either. It seems odd, it would be odd to claim that nobody could afford villas in the territory of the Iceni 250 years after the revolt, which is when most of the villas in Britain really date to. So it seems reasonable to assume that the Iceni simply weren't terribly interested in mosaics and villas. They were, however, interested in in religious activity. The temple complex that we excavated in the northeast of the town became ever grander through the 2nd century. And we've done quite a lot of work on this recently using excavation and ground penetrating radar. And the latest temple building, which dates to about the 2nd century, was enormous. It's the second, as far as we know, it's the second biggest Romano-Celtic temple in Britain. Unfortunately, it's not the biggest. I could have got a lot more media coverage if it had been the biggest. The second biggest is no good. You know, no one's interested in second biggest. But nonetheless, it's pretty huge. And compared with these very small public buildings that we get in the rest of Caister, it's really quite exceptional. The foundations of it go down about 2 meters. And we have a lot of signs of interesting religious behavior at the town. One of the most interesting things we've identified is this huge circuit of defensive ditches that run around the town, creating a sort of kite shape. And the ditches don't last very long. They're dug, created in about the start of the 2nd century and filled in by the end of that century. But the filling in involved the placing of objects and also bodies. Here we can see our excavations to the south of the town through the ditch system. And the ditches seem to have a symbolic function. When we dug them, we found quite a lot of interesting objects. This rather nice bottom, which you can see on the left here, is a Venus's bottom. It's part of a Venus figurine. Number one of several figurines like this that we found in these ditches. And we had this inhumation burial of a very severely disabled individual. He suffered from a hip disease and would have had real problems in moving, but nonetheless lives to about the age of about 40. But he ends up being buried in this ditch. On the other side of the town, we have glass, quite elaborate glass vessels being placed into the ditch, and also what seems to be a complete horse at the bottom of it. Elsewhere in the town, we have what we now call structured deposits. You may well, if you've ever watched Time Team, now most people realize that when archaeologists say that something is ritual, it means they haven't got a clue what it actually is. And so we've now started to, in the Roman period, rather than calling things ritual deposits, we call them structured deposits, because that sounds more scientific, like we know what it is. But certainly we do have the impression that people are placing things, they are selecting objects, they're selecting bits of rubbish, really, and placing them in the ground for reasons that we don't really understand. So you'll get almost complete pottery vessels, sometimes killed or put out of use by the drilling of holes or the breaking of little bits in, and also the selection of bits of wild animals to be placed in these pits. We don't really know why, but it's very, very common in Roman Britain, and it seems to be an Iron Age behavior that survives into the Roman period, placing things in the ground for particular reasons. We have a lot of nice votive objects as well. Miniature objects, miniature tools are quite popular in the territory of the Iceni, and this is a rather nice miniature votive spade. In terms of the deities, we have local gods and goddesses probably functioning alongside Roman ones, or gods and goddesses who are sort of combined. We certainly have evidence of Mercury, Venus, and Neptune. On the right, we've got another pipe clay figurine from our ditch. Mercury again with his bottom out. And we also have this rather wonderful curse tablet. This is, I have to tell you about this because it's my favorite thing from the site. It comes from dredging of the River Taz next to the site. And it's a complaint from a chap called Naze, or probably Nazenius, that someone possibly called Vroxius has stolen some things from him. And these include a wreath, bracelets, a cap, a mirror, a headdress, a pair of leggings, and all sorts of other stuff. And then we get this sort of rather formulaic curse that says, it says, if you, Neptune, want the leggings, they shall become yours at the price of his blood. And so I really like the idea that if you're an all-powerful oceanic deity, what you really want, what's going to tip the balance for you to act on this person's behalf, is a pair of second-hand leggings. And I really like this because it just really brings it down to a very, very human level. Now, although they were quite happy to expand the range of available gods, the Iceni seemed a lot less enthusiastic about Mediterranean cuisine, culinary habits, amphory in ditches, culinary habits, and this sort of thing. We get very little use of oil or wine, so they're not really taking on aspects of the Mediterranean diet. I'll just leave the dead out of it for the moment. One of the things that the Iceni showed no reluctance about taking new habits on is hairstyles. Hairstyles don't get as much attention as they should in Roman Britain, but it's a big signifier of identity in the ancient world. Boudica's hair, of course, gets a lot of attention, and the long hair and beardiness of barbarians gets a lot of attention. But elaborate women's hairstyles really take off in Roman Britain, and the finds of numerous hairpins suggest that the Iceni were really keen participants. The other major introduction into Roman Britain in this period is, of course, literacy, and Caister is full of people who are writing. There are numerous finds of stelae for writing on wax tablets, and we also have fragments of inkwells. This is not surprising because Roman towns were centers of tax collection, but finds of graffiti show that all levels of society were participating to some extent. So we've got a sense that the Iceni are participating in some aspects of Roman Britain, but not others. What does this mean? Are they actively rebelling, or are they just not very interested? Part of the problem that we have is that our idea of what is normal for Roman Britain is a very artificial idea based on a handful of quite exceptional towns like Colchester, Silchester, London, or Verulamium. And these towns represent ways of high status expression that were actually quite restricted in scope. Along with quite a lot of the other parts of the country, the Iceni probably had different ways of expressing wealth and status, and this may be simply less visible archaeologically. They may have had large herds of animals or a lot of portable wealth, which may have been far more significant to the Iceni than a mosaic. So to sum up, then, Boudicea and the Boudiccan revolt cast a very long shadow over the Iceni. We have a character which is in many ways an invention of Roman writers who were writing in particular ways to make specific rhetorical points about a single specific rhetorical points about their own world. And a single episode has shaped our understanding of several centuries of life in the region. Tacitus's testimony of famine and impoverishment has shaped this whole story of the Iceni. If you take this story away, however, you get a sense of the Iceni responding in a particular way to the coming of Rome. Like most of the regions of Britain, they took in the things that they wanted that were of relevance to them and largely ignored the rest of it. And in this, they were little different to other parts of Britain, which remained a strange little island on the fringes of the empire. So the Boudiccan revolt is a significant episode in the history of Britain as a Roman province, but the Iceni are more than just Boudicca. They're as fascinating and complex as any of the peoples of Britain. And as we do more at Caister, hopefully we will succeed in demonstrating that. And hopefully we may even convince Channel 4. And I just want to end briefly by acknowledging that this is, it's me talking here, but this represents the work and the money of an enormous number of people, but particularly the work of my colleagues at volunteers at Caister Roman Project. And at that point, I will stop and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'll stop sharing the screen too.
We've only had one question so far from Tony Tuckwell asking, are there other examples of early British female tribe leaders, or is Boudicca a one-off?
Well, there's the other really famous one is Cartimandua, who's Queen of the Brigantes, and she seems to have been based. There's sort of reasonable arguments to put her at Stanek, up the A1, and she's again a major tribal leader. But as I say, the Romans are particularly interested in having women as tribal leaders in Britain, partly because it just emphasizes how weird the Britons were. They were particularly interested in showing that the British were weird and behaving in barbarian ways. And of course, one of the most barbarian things you could do would be to have a woman as your leader.
Yeah.
We've got another question from Katie Lee Smith. I was wondering, could the broken deposits be an older tradition passed on from indigenous communities? I may be wrong, but thought there were existences of broken deposits throughout the Bronze Age and earlier.
Yeah, I mean, in Britain, really right through from the Bronze Age to the late Roman period, people have always been interested in putting things in the ground, and the idea of putting things out of use to put them in the ground. So in the Bronze Age, we get this with swords, for example, places like another bronze material at places like Flag Fen. And so, yeah, breaking things to put them out of use. The idea of it's possibly conspicuous consumption. It's making offerings, to particular deities. But yeah, it's a very common thing, and I think we can. It's now generally accepted that these early practices, carrying on, from prehistoric Britain, well into the Roman period, and even putting some of the great late Roman hoards, like sort of the Mildenhall hoard or the Thetford treasure. Yeah, there is still, I think, something significant. People are not just hiding things from, for safekeeping. They are putting things into the ground for particular reasons. So yeah, I think it's a long running practice.
Thank you.
There's another question from Katie. I was also wondering how much archaeological evidence there is for the massacre. Did you mean the massacre of the Iceni?
Yeah, I was wondering.
At the end, but when they were defeated by the Romans.
Yeah.
Yeah, the actual the site of the final battle is a lot of ink has been spilt on the final battle, the location of it, and people have tried to locate it from the descriptions in Tacitus, particularly. The problem is classical writers use kind of stereotypical battle descriptions that will be familiar to their audiences, and so the best arguments have really been put forward for I think it's Mansetter, which but there's no evidence has been found of that final battle. It may yet come up. I mean, the loss of the legions in the Teutoburg forests has been, that battle site has been found in the last sort of 20 years or so. But yeah, the massacre of the final battle, we don't know. Also, actually, the massacre of people in Colchester, although some bodies have been found, despite the fact that the entire population is supposed to have been massacred, actually relatively few bodies have been found. So, quite what the death toll was, we don't know. But it would have, I think it would have been pretty unpleasant for all concerned.
Thank you.
Next question was from Jenny Moyer. What might the ear scoop have been used for?
What might the what have been used for?
Ear scoop.
The ear scoops. Yeah, the ear scoops. Well, as the name suggests, they're for cleaning. It seems to be for cleaning your ears out. And one of the things that we do get in Roman Britain is, with the coming of the Romans, there is an enormous development of interest in preening, general bodily maintenance. So cosmetic sets, nail cleaners, tweezers, things like that become very, very common. And certainly, and both sexes seem to be participating in it. And as I mentioned, you do get these really lots of a real sense of hair being maintained, quite elaborate haircuts being employed. So yes, there's a lot of primping, a lot of preening, a lot of interest in your personal appearance that comes in with the with the Romans. And it's not just the Romans. It's not just, as I say, there's probably not many immigrants in Roman Britain. It's, you know, it is the local population participating in this. So yeah, cleaning ear scoops definitely seem to be for cleaning earwax out.
The next question is from Ian Vance. Is there any genetic evidence from Iceni that might link to DNA in the current population?
No, and there's a number of, we may be able to get some genetic evidence from late Roman burials. The problem with the Iceni as a population is that we don't really know what they're doing with the dead. We have, I think, something in North, I think we've probably got about 30 bodies or bits of body for the entire 800 years of the Iron Age in Norfolk. And they're disposing of the dead in ways that don't leave archaeological traces. And that may mean sort of putting them out to be pecked by, eaten by wild animals, just putting them back to nature in some way like that. And so, unfortunately, we don't really have enough dead people for genetic evidence. We do have late Roman bodies, and I think over the next few years, the genetic data from the Roman period, we're starting to get really good genetic and isotope data from Roman Britain, and I think it's really going to transform our understanding of the Roman population of Britain. It certainly seems that our population is very mobile. There are people moving about in Roman Britain. There are quite a lot of immigrants coming in to Roman Britain. It's a very multicultural society. And equally, you've got British people sort of going out into the Roman Empire, and they're turning up a lot as well. So I think the genetics is going to be really exciting over the next 10 years or so.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Angela Kilmartin. Were there any Roman wives of note in Norfolk who came here with their husbands?
We don't know. We don't know really. In terms of, we do certainly have quite a lot of evidence of immigrant women in Britain. There's a very wealthy North African woman, a mixed race woman from York, which is a particularly important example. Obviously, the most famous wife in Roman Britain is Regina, the wife of Barates, who's on South Shields, and she's a woman of the Catavalorni, so probably from the Hertfordshire region, and she's married to a Syrian called Barates, who comes from Palmyra, and they both end up at South Shields, which may be regarded as an error, who knows? And she's probably Barates' freed slave, and so there's but she's from Hertfordshire and ends up married to a Syrian on Hadrian's Wall. So there's women are certainly moving about, as are a lot of people, and there is certainly lots of immigrants moving about and marrying each other. And again, the evidence of this is increasing all the time through particularly through analysis of stable isotopes for looking at migration.
There's another question from Peter Evans. Did the Iceni prosper when the Romans left?
Well, it's the east of Britain is the bit that's probably most changed by. It has really dramatic changes in the 5th century. How many people the Romans leaving is quite a tricky thing. Although we talk about the Romans leaving, I think the best way of thinking about it is that nobody actually left, or hardly anybody did. Some legions, some soldiers disappeared in about 406 or something like that. That's about 20,000 20,000 men left to go and fight on the continent in the early 5th century. But those are the only people who left out of a population. So that's 20,000 out of a population of probably about 3 million or so. But what happens after that is a bit, this is where we get the so-called Anglo-Saxon invasions. How many people that involved, we don't know. But what does change is everything in the east of Britain. Dress styles of building, styles of hair. People get long hair, lots of beards. Again, we know from combs and things like that. And diet. So there's really dramatic cultural shifts at the end of the Roman period. What actually causes that, we don't know. We don't know if it's a new population, if it's Anglo-Saxon invaders, or whether it's people again taking on new fashions and new ways of life as they had at the start of the Roman period. But what actually happens to our local population in Eastern Britain, we really don't know.
I haven't got any more questions in the chat. Are there anybody else got a question?
Yes, please.
Ian?
An inquiry sort of thought. We've occasionally made expeditions, forays after good talks. Notably, we went to London with a speaker. In the future, is it possible, Professor Bowden, if we showed any interest, to visit your site at Caister, and maybe even you show some of us who are interested around?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're allowed to, when we're all allowed out of our houses again, yeah, I'll be very happy to take you around. I mean, we will hopefully be digging in the second half of August this year. So, and it's always nice, it's obviously always nice to visit an active dig when that's going on. But yeah, equally, I'll be happy to take you. And that's also when I'm definitely down there the most. But I would, I'll be very happy to take you around.
Excellent. Can I, great talk. Can I ask
a couple more questions, Ian?
Okay.
There's a question from Laura Towles. With the burials that have been located, had they taken on the Roman burial style?
At Caister, it's very hard to tell. I think it's a really good question. One of the things that we have very few bodies of the burials and even cremations of the early Roman period. And so my thinking is that the Iron Age burial customs, which, as I say, don't leave any archaeological traces, I think they're carrying on well into the Roman period. The bodies that we do have at Caister, which date to the sort of 3rd or 4th centuries AD, they're pretty odd. They're being put into the ground in quite weird ways. We have nothing that I would really say is a normal burial from Caister, and so at Caister it's quite hard to tell. But I think certainly in that part of the world, there is relatively little adoption of Roman burial practice, and I think actually that's probably the case for most of Roman Britain. Although we do get quite a lot of Roman burials cropping up, there's still not that many of them for the number of people that we had in Roman Britain. So it may be that the Roman cemeteries that we get across parts of Roman Britain, is in some ways those are always the exception rather than the rule. People may still have been disposing of the dead in ways that don't leave much trace.
Thank you. And one final question from Paul Green. Were the foundations 2 meters deep? Would the peaty soil have been much wetter 2,000 years ago?
Well, the foundations that we had of the temples that were so deep, they were they're in masonry, so wouldn't be sort of too affected by soil conditions. And actually, we have a very sandy soil at Caister, rather than the peat. Peat in Norfolk is quite interesting, and of course there's big peat deposits in Norfolk, a lot of which were quarried out to create the Norfolk Broads in the sort of 16th and 17th centuries. So there's been quite a lot of change in the conditions of the peat over the years. But we're at Caister, we're on that sort of sandy, gravelly bit of the geology, which is generally favoured by people in the sort of late Iron Age and early Roman periods, because it's easier, it's lighter soils, it's easier to farm.
Thank you. There's no more questions, Ian, at the moment, so if I hand back to you.
Thank you very much. On our behalf, can I ask John Simons, who's a committee member, to propose our vote of thanks, please?
Yes, Ian, I'll do that. First, Bowden, thank you very much for a fantastic talk this afternoon. Very, very interesting, and particularly interesting, I think, for many of us who probably have family roots going back into the soil of East Anglia. I should have probably asked the question during question time, but I should ask us, can we expect your definitive book on the subject to be out anytime soon? Because your talk has certainly whetted the appetite as well, and it'd be great to find out a great deal more detail about it. It's interesting also to hear the Roman view of us 2,000 years ago as I think I quote, a strange little island on the fringes of the empire filled with barbarians. I'm guessing there's a lot of people over the water there who still think that current times. But seriously, it's been a great way to spend the Saturday afternoon. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of the association.
Thank you. And in terms of
can I, before you go?
Yes. Will Bowden is just showing us his book.
No, this is not the definitive publication by any means, but it's a sort of brief history of it's a brief history of Venter Icenorum, and it's available from Bitten Books, I think, for the princely sum of I think it's a £5. So absolutely cheap at the price.
Who published again?
It's by Bitten Books.
Oh yes,
so,
yes.
As in the bird.
Yes.
But it's I think also available from the Norfolk Archaeological Trust website
Right.
as well.
Thank you.